Hello everyone, welcome to video 5 where we will be discussing the CA 2025 decision trees. Today my suggestion is that you have guide 5 open and in particular 5A, 5B and 5C, which are the decision trees. You might also like to have watched video 4 before you come to video 5. Video 4 provides an overview of the CA 2025 assessment process. And then the last thing I'd like to mention to you is that video 6, which deals with RPL, will also refer back to the decision trees that we're going to discuss today. And something that is also important to note is that from an RPL perspective, we use the Learning Outcome Review decision tree for the Acumens, and we use the PDS or Summative decision tree for the professional values and attitudes. And the reason why I'm hoping will become a little bit more apparent as you watch this video today. We're going to start our discussion today with the professional values and attitudes. If you refer back to the competency framework document, which is guide 1 within the series. Now, I didn't suggest that you look at that from a resource perspective, but this is really where we've taken these two matrices from. You will see that there's a different matrix for professional values and attitudes compared to the one that is used for the Acumens, and that has bearing in terms of how the decision trees have been set up. For the professional values and attitudes, we are measuring proficiency based on two dimensions, frequency and context. Frequency refers to how often does this behavior show up, and the context refers to the complexity of the scenario that the trainee is faced with at the time when they are expected to display this behavior. We therefore only measure the professional values and attitudes proficiency at a summative level, because frequency is involved. So frequency means that we can't really measure it at a formative level. The reviewer is only being presented with one example of evidence. So they are not really equipped to measure how often this behavior shows up. That can only be done at a summative level. The reviewer role in the learning outcome review is to take the evidence that the trainee has documented and confirm whether that really happened, and this is what played out, and also to check that the trainee has documented the evidence at a sufficient level of quality that it is sufficient for the evaluator and the assessor to consider at a summative level. The trainee's role in turn is to submit evidence that meets CICA's quality guidelines, the journalist questions, who, what, where, when, how, and perhaps even why. And also that it meets the details of the context in which the behavior was demonstrated, so that the evaluator and the assessor can determine how complex that scenario was that the trainee faced. The evaluator and the assessor, their turn is at a summative assessment level, and they need to actually rate the trainee's proficiency. So let's have a look at the dimensions in a little bit more detail. If we talk about frequency, remember what I said is that when the trainee is faced with a certain scenario, how do they show up? How do they behave? If in some scenarios the trainee shows up one way and then when presented with another scenario shows up in another way, that means that they occasionally show up in the way that is expected. When we start talking about intermediate and advanced frequency, we are seeing that the trainee starts to show up in the way that is expected no matter what scenario is presented to them. The difference between the advanced and the intermediate frequency is that sometimes trainees are only presented with a certain set of circumstances within the training contract. So we've made an allowance in the decision tree that a trainee can still get to an advanced level of proficiency, even though the types of scenarios that they encounter during the training contract might be limited. What we're really pushing for is that the trainee is able to show up in the same way, no matter what they are presented with. And then when we come to the context, we're saying when the trainee showed up in this way, was the context simple, straightforward? Were they even perhaps prompted to show up in that certain way? Or are we starting to see that the trainees are starting to move towards a complexity within some of the situations which they're seeing, and possibly even quite difficult scenarios and complex situations that they're faced with on a more regular basis? So let's have a look at that decision tree. The decision tree that I'd like to suggest that you have open at this point is 5A, the professional values and attitudes decision tree, which is only at a PDS level. You will notice again that there is no decision tree for the learning outcome review. We're going to have a look at the decision tree together, and I would also like to remind you that there will be further training which will take you through a few examples that you can play with in working with this decision tree. Today I really just want to show you how the decision tree works and that there are a few ways that the trainee might get to the same result. If you look at the top here, it's important to remember that the summative assessment of proficiency is based on cumulative evidence presented in the current and previous PDS cycles, if that's relevant. So that could mean evidence presented in a learning outcome review, and it could also mean evidence presented in the recognition of prior learning PDS. Let's come to our decision tree. You will see that there are two routes for the trainee to get to a level 3 advanced proficiency, and that talks to the intermediate and advanced frequency that we discussed earlier. So our first question points to advanced frequency. So we're going to start at the top level, and then we're slowly going to eliminate down the levels of proficiency. Has the trainee demonstrated this behavior on multiple occasions and in a variety of circumstances? Now, multiple might only mean 2. It does mean not 1. Okay, so at the moment the trainee has only demonstrated one example, you're going to find yourself right down here at the bottom of the decision tree. But let's look at a case where a trainee has presented more than one example of this behavior. Has the trainee demonstrated this behavior on multiple occasions? Yes, in a variety of circumstances. So here we might go, are the two scenarios or multiple scenarios that the trainee has presented different? Do they present different circumstances, or are they more or less the same? Let's assume that these are two quite different circumstances. Was the behavior demonstrated in situations that are sufficiently difficult or complex to display an appropriate professional mindset at entry level into the profession? Now, we might look at the circumstances and the examples presented, and some are at an advanced level and others we feel are more basic. So let's assume that at least one of these situations is in an advanced context. So the behavior demonstrated was in a complex scenario, the kind of thing that the trainee might encounter as a professional. Okay, and what we're saying there is that the trainee had to display responsibility, autonomy, and experience in responding to this. They had to identify that this was the kind of scenario that they needed to show up with this behavior, this learning outcome. If the answer is yes, we move on to the next question. And now there is the question, is there evidence from any source that the trainee will not be able to consistently demonstrate this behavior in an advanced context? Now let's assume we've been in one PDS cycle, and the trainee in this PDS cycle showed up in the right way in all the circumstances that were presented to them. So yes, the context might have been a little bit more basic in some of them, and in others they were more advanced, but the trainee consistently showed up in the same way. And we have got no other examples or nothing that is concerning us that the trainee might show up differently if presented with a different scenario. We then rate the trainee at a level 3. Now let's consider where the trainee has presented a more narrow set of contexts, even though they've presented multiple examples of evidence. We have the same question. Did the trainee need to display a professional mindset at entry level to the profession? Was the scenario that was presented, even if it was more limited, sufficiently complex that it is what we would expect of a professional? So the trainee still had to demonstrate a high level of responsibility, autonomy, and experience in responding in this way to the scenario that was presented. And then the question, because it was a more narrow set of circumstances that was presented, is there evidence from any source that the trainee will not be able to replicate this behavior in other similarly advanced contexts across a variety of circumstances? Or are we concerned that the trainee is only able to respond in this way given the certain limited set of circumstances? If there is a concern, then you're rating the trainee at a level 2. If, however, there is no concern and you believe that the way that the trainee has responded, even given this limited set of circumstances, will be replicated no matter what circumstances they are presented with, then you can rate them at a level 3. Let's talk about the Acumens. You noticed how complex it can get to measure proficiency even when there are only 2 dimensions. With the Acumens, we have 4 dimensions: task understanding, task completion, guidance, and dependencies. I'm going to spend a little less time on the matrix and a little bit more time in the decision tree for the Acumens, because I think it will make a little bit more sense if we work through that together. What I do just want to highlight here is that the Acumens, unlike the professional values and attitudes, are measured both at a formative level and at a summative level, and that unlike the 2016 program, you will see 2 different decision trees at a learning outcome review and a PDS level. The same decision tree as used in the learning outcome review is also used for RPL purposes, and I think it will become obvious why that is the case when we start looking at the 2 decision trees. The trainee's role is the same for the Acumens. They still need to submit evidence that meets CICA's quality guidelines, needs to answer the journalist questions: who, what, where, when, how, and possibly even why. And they need to reflect specific details of the technical context. In particular, they talk to the 4 different dimensions so that it will help them explain how that learning outcome was displayed and also assist the reviewer to determine the rating of proficiency. The trainee will also be rating themselves in the learning outcome review, so they will have the opportunity to revisit their evidence if they find it difficult to answer some of the questions in the decision tree. There's that interplay within the electronic assessment tool where the trainee can document the evidence, check the decision tree, go back, document some more evidence, check the decision tree, and ultimately come to their own rating and then hand the learning outcome review to a reviewer to provide them with a rating of proficiency. The reviewer's role: they need to be able to corroborate the evidence to say, yes, the trainee actually did this, and then also to provide them with a rating of proficiency. And then the evaluator and the assessor uses the cumulative evidence built up from the learning outcome reviews and the cumulative ratings provided from the learning outcome reviews as the basis for the summative assessment. So while we're on the matrix, I did say we quickly look at the matrix and then move on to the decision tree. There are 4 dimensions for the Acumens: task understanding, task completion, guidance, and dependencies. Now, guidance is the one that talks directly to the Acumen. We're talking about, does the trainee require guidance in terms of displaying the Acumen, demonstrating the Acumen, conflict resolution, writing an algorithm, building a relationship, determining the external factors on a business, making a critical decision. All of those things are the actual Acumen. Now, we know as professionals that we do consult with our colleagues. We do ask questions for information. That is not guidance in the context of the Acumens. Guidance means somebody had to tell the trainee how to actually demonstrate the Acumen. They had to tell them how to build the relationship. They had to tell them how to resolve the conflict. That's very different from asking advice or consulting with a knowledge of what actually needs to be done. It's a very different process. I'm hoping you're starting to see the nuance in terms of what guidance means for a trainee when looking at the Acumens. And then task understanding, task completion, and dependencies talks about the context within which the Acumen is displayed. Now, when you look at this matrix, you're probably wondering, now, how on earth does a trainee get to an advanced level of proficiency? So similarly to the professional values and attitudes, where we've made some allowances for the fact that a training program presents a limited set of opportunities to a trainee to demonstrate certain abilities or behaviors. Here we have said that in terms of the guidance dimension, the trainee must be at the level where they require little or no guidance in order to demonstrate the ability, the Acumen. But when it comes to the context, provided that they are at an intermediate or advanced level in task understanding, task completion, and dependencies, they can get to an overall level of proficiency of 3. Remember, similarly to what we said earlier for the professional values and attitudes, not all acumens need to be demonstrated to a level 3 proficiency, but most of them need to be displayed to a level 3 proficiency. And you'll see how that plays out in the decision tree. Let's have a look at a little bit of the detail so that you can understand why intermediate or advanced could be allowed. When you look at task understanding, there is a vast difference between a trainee only being able to understand something at a basic level and only applying key ideas and principles. The moment we enter into the territory of the intermediate understanding, they have to start applying some analysis and evaluation to the work that they're doing. At an advanced level, they take that analysis and evaluation and also convert it into a process that would allow them to make useful recommendations. So you can see the shift, whereas the foundational level of understanding requires no analysis or evaluation. The trainee is simply doing what's required and applying very basic knowledge. When it comes to task completion, we're expecting that trainees would start to be able to initiate the tasks on their own and start integrating acumen, skills, knowledge sources across the value creation chain from a technical perspective, or perhaps applying both a behavior and an acumen at the same time, 2 different acumens at the same time, more acumens at the same time. So that's really talking about task completion and the complexity of the context and what is actually required from the trainee in order to demonstrate this particular acumen. At a foundational level, the trainee would only be required to follow predetermined steps using limited knowledge and skills. And this also talks to a scenario where the trainee is really prompted in terms of what they need to do. When it gets to the intermediate and advanced levels of task completion, the trainee is having to initiate from themselves. They need to demonstrate the awareness of what's required, and they're not simply following a predetermined set of steps. When it comes to dependencies, what this really means and what can help you to think about this is independence and dependence. At a foundational level, the trainee is working under supervision, and the supervisor is really taking responsibility for the work that's being completed. Very low level of risk, and they're using established processes. So really the trainee is just doing what they're told to do, and the dependence is very much on their supervisor. When we get to an intermediate level, the trainee is starting to carry out some of the tasks independently. They're very much responsible for the quality of their own work, and this could be within the context of a team, or perhaps it's work that they're completing for themselves. As we start moving into an advanced level of proficiency within that dimension, the trainee is really managing their own work. They're responsible for both the quality and the quantity of the work that is produced, and they may be responsible for somebody else's work or for managing a team or certain functions. So you can see the play between the intermediate and the advanced when it comes to the dependencies, the independence of the trainee, and the responsibility and autonomy that is required. Let's have a look at the decision tree, and perhaps that will also help you to put a little bit of this into a better context for yourselves. The 2 decision trees that I would like you to open now is the Acumen decision tree for the learning outcome review, which we'll look at first, and then we'll have a look at the Acumen decision tree for the professional development summary. Okay, so when we were looking at the professional values and attitudes, I reminded you to look at the top of the decision tree. And here you can see that from a formative assessment perspective, we're really looking at the evidence that's presented for that Acumen learning outcome in a particular learning outcome review. This is the trainee first doing a self-assessment of their level of proficiency, and then the reviewer providing the trainee with a rating using the same decision tree. You will remember from the matrix that guidance was the key dimension around the acumen, and that is therefore the first question that we are asking in the decision tree. Did the trainee require little or no guidance about how to demonstrate the learning outcome before or during completion of the task? and that would be considered advanced guidance, in other words, advanced proficiency in the guidance dimension. If the trainee required little or no guidance, it pushes us into the top part of the decision tree. Now, unlike the professional values and attitudes decision tree, there is only one route to level 3 proficiency. But I want to remind you that in the matrix, we said that either intermediate or advanced proficiency in the other 3 dimensions would allow the trainee to get to a level 3. So the next 3 questions allow a trainee some flexibility in terms of the level that they're demonstrating in the other dimensions. The first question is around task completion. Was the trainee able to initiate and perform the task integrating multiple knowledge sources and skills? And that could be other acumens, it could be information sources, it could be technical disciplines, integration of those. If the trainee was integrating, then we're starting to enter advanced and intermediate task completion. You'll see, for example, where a trainee is having to demonstrate one of the ethics learning outcomes, that they are very likely also having to draw on some of the relational acumens in terms of how they work with the person that they're working with. They might also need to integrate a wide set of different technical disciplines and technical knowledge in coming to displaying a certain acumen. So let's assume that the answer is yes again. In applying the learning outcome in this technical context, was the trainee able to analyze, evaluate, and make useful recommendations where appropriate? Again, we're talking advanced intermediate. You'll remember the element of making useful recommendations came through from an advanced proficiency level in that dimension. And we're saying where appropriate. So if the training office is requiring the trainee to be able to make recommendations and they're not able to, that's taking them down a level. And it is starting to bring into question whether it is sustainable at a level 3 proficiency. So remember this when we get to the ultimate level of proficiency. So in applying the learning outcome in this technical context, was the trainee able to analyze and evaluate? Yes. Were they able to make useful recommendations? Not so much. You might be taking it to a no answer instead of a yes. But let's assume that the trainee was able to analyze and evaluate and was able to make useful recommendations when it was required. Answers yes. And now ultimately, did the trainee assume responsibility for the quality of their own work and or responsibility for the quality of work of others where they are managing others or supervising others? So again, if you have a look at these last 2 questions, it really allows for a variety of contexts where the trainee is expected to make recommendations, where they're not expected to make recommendations, where they are required to monitor and supervise others' work and when they're not. So it allows for that advanced or intermediate understanding. If the answer to all of these is yes, the trainee is getting to a level 3 proficiency. Remember, we are at a formative level. We are not at a summative level. So the reviewer does not need to take into account other circumstances. Oh, but I saw you on another job. Oh, but my experience of you previously was that. No. This is based on the evidence that is presented and the context within which the acumen was displayed. The reviewer is simply corroborating whether this is valid in this particular situation. That does not preclude the reviewer from reverting a learning outcome review and saying to the trainee, we also think that you should be providing some evidence on another learning outcome, or that they need to present the rest of the evidence or something more. So the reviewer does have scope to say you're not painting the full picture here. But what we're saying is that the reviewer doesn't have to draw on anything else. They can simply limit themselves to this particular scenario and this set of evidence. In the decision tree, if at any point the trainee drops out of that question, so advanced guidance, they drop into intermediate, they'll be asked the same set of questions for the other dimensions, but they won't be able to get to a level 3 proficiency. The moment the trainee drops into a foundational level for any of the questions, they're going to be sitting at a much lower level of proficiency. You will also notice that guidance is key right throughout. So let's have a look at the Acumen decision tree at a professional development summary level. You will recall that the professional development summary decision tree for the professional values and attitudes started with a question around whether the trainee had presented multiple examples for that particular behavior. Here, the question starts with, has the trainee received any level 3 ratings in the learning outcome review to date? So that's the starting point, the evidence that has been presented. If you have a look at the top, similarly to the professional values and attitudes decision tree for the PDS, the summative assessment of proficiency is based on evidence presented for the learning outcome in the current and previous PDS cycles, and that could include an RPL process. So we're asking, were there level 3 ratings in a learning outcome review, but also perhaps in an RPL process? So we're looking at both of those. If the answer is yes, then the question is there sufficient evidence to suggest that the trainee is able to consistently demonstrate this learning outcome at an advanced level? So let's say, for example, the trainee presented a level 1, level 2, level 3. You as the evaluator or the assessor would then need to make the decision as to whether the trainee is able to consistently demonstrate at a level 3. With that set of evidence, it's likely that you probably say you'd need to see a little bit more level 3 evidence. But perhaps that last scenario was so advanced that really the trainee has lifted themselves out of the level 2, and that you truly believe that this trainee will be able to continue to demonstrate at a level 3 advanced proficiency, no matter what scenario is presented to them. Then you can rate them at a level 3 proficiency at a summative level. But you have to remember this question. Is there evidence from any source that the trainee will not be able to continue to demonstrate this learning outcome in all areas at an advanced level in future? So that's basically saying this acumen that they displayed in this particular scenario, or in these particular scenarios that have been presented, is there evidence from any other source that indicates that a trainee would not be able to demonstrate it if they were presented with a different scenario? That's the catch-all. The decision tree really follows the ratings in the learning outcome reviews. You can see that if the answer to the first question was no, the next question was, did the trainee get any level 2 ratings in learning outcome reviews to date? And then it drops down to, did the trainee receive any level 1 ratings in learning outcome reviews to date? You will remember in the 2016 program that we used the same decision trees for formative and summative assessment. That often resulted in quite a bit of confusion, especially for trainees, where they were presenting a certain level of evidence or getting ratings at a level 3 or 4 during their PSRs and TSRs. And then when they got to the ANA, they felt like they were rated down at a summative level, and they couldn't understand the difference since the same decision tree was being used. In the CA 2025 training program, we acknowledge the limitations of using the same decision tree, and that is why we've set it out in this way. The starting point is the evidence that's in the learning outcome reviews, but we also acknowledge that the evaluator and the assessor needs to draw on all of the information at their disposal in coming to the summative rating of proficiency, and that what has been presented in the learning outcome reviews might not paint the full picture. That brings us to the end of our video today. Please remember that the upskilling training will also provide you with some examples that you can use to work through the decision trees. And you're also welcome to take the decision trees, take the set of learning outcomes, and see how it plays out for you in some of the scenarios that you imagine your trainees will go through in your training program. Thank you for your attention. Video 6 is up next on recognition of prior learning.